All right, Rabbi, say good morning. Excuse me, good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsor for the month of Shvat, Mrs. Selma Woolf, for dedicating all the Sherman Joshos this month with immense gratitude for the refuos from Hashem and the merit of refuos for all of those in need, and the zechus of our brave soldiers, and the zechus of the return of all of our hostages. Our week of learning sponsors, Yehudah Bracha Buchwalter, in memory of Rabbi Yehudah's father, Usher Buchwalter, on the occasion of his first yard site. And our Daf Yomi sponsors, the Tusk Family, and the zechus of refuos shalema for Tzvi Menachem ben Chava Tzivia, and Menashe Bracha Efron, in honor of the bris of Baby Boy Efron today. Mazal Tov to Ben-Zion and Ilana Efron and the entire family, and also in memory of Menashe's mother, Beatrice Efron, Brina Bas Alter Yerachmiel, whose 11th yard set is this week. We hope down in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the Neshama will have an aliya, and the families a Neshama, and all of those who need a refuos should have one together with Kol Cholei Yisrael. And of course, we dedicate all of Maseches Baba Kamma, Li'ilu Nishmas, Master Sergeant Eliyahu Michal Harush, Hashem Yikom Damo. May HaKadosh Baruch Hu grant an aliya to his Neshama and a Neshama for his family. We'll say with that, let us begin. Today's daf is Ayin Hey 75, and we are picking up in Meretz Hashem on Ayin Dalid at the Mishnah. At the Gemara. We actually we got a little further, right? We got to 2 dots. Is that correct? To Esvei? Yeah, excellent. We got to the second 2 dots. So the Gemara, or the first 2 dots. Gufa. Amrafuna Amrav. Mod b'knas v'achar kach bo edin pater. Suppose to remember again. So we've been dealing with an interesting concept of mod knas pater, which means that if you are obligated in a knas payment. So remember again. The definition or the distinction between knas and mamon is that mamon is a monetary payment where the payment really matches the damage or the responsibility. Knas is some inflated arbitrary amount. So for example, I shouldn't say inflated because sometimes it may even be less than the actual value, but it's really not corresponding to the actual damage. So for example, Arba v'chamisha, right? The idea that you have to pay 4 times the value of the sheep, 5 times the value of the cow, that's obviously knas, right? That's not ma'on, that's a penalty payment. So there's a concept by knas of modeh b'knas pater. If you admit that you owe a knas, then ultimately, again, you're pater. We'll derive actually where we find that from in just a little bit. So the interesting case we were dealing with yesterday, the Gemara said, was the statement of Rav, was that if a person is modeh b'knas and then witnesses come. So let's say, for example, Ruvain shows up in Beis Din, and Ruvain says, I stole and slaughtered Shimon's sheep. So now ultimately, again, Ruvain admitted that he owes 4 times penalty payment. He owns arba. He's pater. What happens if after his admission, witnesses show up and say and claim, give testimony that he indeed stole and slaughtered? So Rav said, once you admit that you're pater. That's it. Even if witnesses subsequently show up, you're still pater. Okay, so we're going to analyze that. Says the Gemara, Eisir Rav Chisda Rafuna. So Rav Chisda is the kasha to Rafuna. Let's listen to this story. There was a story from Rabbi Gamliel. Shesima es ein Tavi avdo. He blinded the eye of Tavi, his servant. Now, remember again, this was not done intentionally; it was done accidentally. Remember again, it's interesting. In Am Yisroel, Monday through Thursday night, we are learning Maseches brachas. So interestingly enough, just last week we had a beautiful Mishnah about Rabbi Gamliel, or maybe 2 weeks ago, Rabbi Gamliel and his servant Tavi. About again, Rabbi Gamliel, when Tavi passed away, Rabbi Gamliel went ahead and was Mekabel Tanchumin. He accepted consolation of him, even though Rabbi Gamliel said we don't normally accept consolation for Avodim Kenanim. Just an interesting idea. So there was unique. This servant Tavi was a righteous Eved. So the story once happened that Rabbi Gamliel blinded the eye of Tavi. V'haya sameach simcha gidola. And Rabbi Gamliel was so happy. Why was Rabbi Gamliel so happy that he blinded his Eved? Look at Rashi. V'haya sameach lefisha Eved kasher haya. V'haya mis'avel shachrero. Ella Hashem Shacher Avdo over Ba'asei. Both say this is incredible. Rabbi Gamliel had always wanted to emancipate his servants, right? Because Tavi was such a good man. And remember again, upon emancipation, the Eved becomes a full-fledged Jew. So in general, Rabbi Gamliel always wanted to emancipate his Eved. What's the problem? The problem is there is an asay. There is a positive commandment to keep your Eved as your Eved. The pasuk is the olam bahem ta'avodu. You shall go ahead and literally work them, keep them as servants forever. So therefore, Rabbi Gamliel was in a little bit of a halachic conundrum. On one hand, He desperately wanted to free Tavi. On the other hand, he was biblically enjoined from doing so. So therefore, again, when it turned out that he blinded Tavi's eye unintentionally, he was happy. I mean, sad for Tavi that Tavi lost an eye, but happy that Tavi was finally going to go free. So the Gemara says, listen to this. He ran into Rabbi Yoshua. Rabbi Gamliel is so happy that he wants to share the news. So he tells Rabbi Yoshua, don't you know that Tavi, my servant, is going out? He's going to be emancipated. Amar lo lama. So Rabbi Yoshua said, no, why? Why is Tavi going to be emancipated? Amar le shesamisi es eno. I blinded his eye. As a result of a loss of limb, he's going to go free. Amar lo ein bidvarecha klum. So Rabbi Yoshua said to Rabbi Gamliel, your words are meaningless. Shekvar ein lo edim. Because at the end of the day, ultimately, again, there's no testimony. There's no witnesses. So the Gemara says, so the point that Rabbi Yeshua is making to Rabbi Gamliel is your testimony by itself doesn't do anything. Remember, Rabbi said the concept that an Eved goes free upon the loss of a limb is a knas. So now you have Rabbi Gamliel going ahead and saying, I blinded my Eved. So ultimately, again, that's Moda B'knas Pater. That's Moda B'knas Pater. Now what's interesting is Rabbi Yoshua said to him, you don't have witnesses. Now what do you see from here? Hayesh lo edim chayiv. Now we'll see what you do see from here is that what? If there were witnesses, the Rabbi Gamliel would have been chayiv. In other words, we'll say, so what do you see from here? Even though Rabbi Gamliel was admitting that he blinded Tavi, so he was Moda B'knas, and Moda B'knas is Pater, Rabbi Yoshua is saying that if witnesses would have shown up afterwards and corroborated that indeed Rabbi Gamliel had blinded Tavi, that ultimately again Tavi would have gone free. So what do you see from here? V'shamina mina moda b'knas v'achar kach bo edim chayiv. So you see from here that's what that halacha l'maisa. If you admit a penalty payment and then afterwards witnesses come along and testify to this same thing, that halacha l'maisa, you're chayiv. So we'll say that contradicts what Rav said before, because beforehand Rav said that moda b'knas v'achar kach bo edim. If you admit a penalty payment, right, you're pater, and then witnesses come and say that in fact you committed this infraction, you're chayiv. I'm sorry, you're pater. That was Rav. Now, based on what we're seeing from Rabbi Yoshua, we see that you're chayiv. So what's going on over here? So the Gemara says, this is fascinating. The Gemara says, no, this case is different. When we say Moda B'knas Pater, Moda B'knas is only Pater when the admission is done in the presence of Beis Din. So it's interesting, I was right, I don't think we ever spoke out this fact before. Only if the admission is done in the presence of Beis Din are you pater. But if you stam admit to knas, that does not exempt you. So when Rabbi Gamliel said, I blinded Tavi, ultimately again, so remember he made this admission outside of Beis Din. Therefore again, the admission was halachically meaningless. And therefore Rabbi Shua told him, if witnesses were to come and to indeed testify to this, you would be chayiv. So the Gemara says, the Rabbi Yoshua Av Beis Din Haba. What's saying Rabbi Yoshua was the Av Beis Din. So we'll say, if Rabbi Gamliel is talking to Rabbi Yoshua, who's in charge of the Beis Din, the Gemara kind of presupposes that this exchange is happening in Beis Din itself. Top of Ayin Hay 75a, Shelo Beis Din Havakai. No, they were having this conversation, but what? It wasn't in Beis Din. So therefore,
still free.
I'm sorry.
Tavi is still free.
Tavi is not necessarily going to be free. That's the point. In other words, when we say Moda B'knas Pater, the Knas says that the Eved goes free. If Rabbi Gamliel is coming along and saying that ultimately I blinded Tavi, he's being Moda B'knas. If he's Moda B'knas, he's Pater. Pater means Tavi doesn't go free, which essentially means, what does it mean Moda B'knas Pater? What does that mean Moda B'knas Pater? What does it mean? It means that when someone admits a penalty, what's our reaction to that? What's our reaction? We ignore it. It's as if no statement was made. So Rabbi Gamliel comes along and says that I blinded my servant Tavi, your Moda B'knas. We ignore that. That's why Rabbi Yoshua said, listen, your statement by itself would be meaningless. If there were witnesses to corroborate that, then Ein Achinami, we would listen to that. But in the absence of witnesses, ultimately, again, halacha l'maisa, the statement is meaningless. So we'll say, Tap of Ainei, I v'atanya, but we learned in the Braisa, Amar lo in bidvarecha klum, shekvar hodisa. Rabbi say, the Braisa says, your words are meaningless because you already admitted my love tanoihi. So we'll say, is this whole thing not a machlokes tanoim? Here we go. The opinion that says that you don't have witnesses, savar moda b'knas v'achar kach bo edim chayiv. That opinion holds also that in general, when you're moda b'knas, right, you're pater, and if witnesses subsequently come along and corroborate the claim, you will be chayiv. And the opinion that says, well, you already admitted the claim, savar moda b'knas v'achar kach bo edim pater. Ultimately, again, he holds that if you're moda b'knas, ultimately again, and afterwards you would be pater. Okay, so Gemara suggesting maybe this whole thing is machlokes and so remember again, let's go with what we know. What we know is that moda b'knas is pater, right? And that seemingly everyone is agreeing with right now. You owe a financial penalty amount, you admit that you owe it, you will be pater. What's the machlokes? The machlokes is afterwards witnesses come and testify about that very event that you went ahead and admitted. So the shaila is, does the testimony of witnesses kind of now make you chayiv? Right? In other words, we to a certain degree ignore your hoda'ah, or no, once you admit your knas, the knas is kind of off the table. And therefore, even if witnesses subsequently come, we simply do not pay heed to their words. To which the Gemara suggesting, maybe some machlokes tanoim. To which the Gemara says, lo, d'chuli al mamod b'knas v'yachar kach bo edim pater. Everyone agrees that if you're moda b'knas and afterwards edim come, you're going to be pater. So what's the machlokes over here? Ubaha kamifligi. So we'll say here's the machlokes. Ubaha kamifligi. Hay tana do amar shekvar in lecha edim. The opinion that read the exchange between Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Gamliel, as Rabbi Yeshua is saying that you don't have witnesses, savar chutz lebezdin hava. He holds that the whole reason why Rabbi Gamliel's hoda'ah was meaningless was because it was made outside of Beis Din. In other words, in order for there to be a moda b'knas pater, the hoda'ah, the admission, has to be made in Beis Din itself. And in this story over here, Rabbi Gamliel runs into Rabbi Yeshua outside of Beis Din. V'hach tana da'amar shekvar hodisa, and the opinion that says, oh no, you already admitted, savar be'Beis Din hava. He holds that halacha l'maisa, ultimately the admission was done in Beis Din. Okay, so I will say, so essentially, we're left with a machlokes. We have Rav telling us that moda b'knas v'achar kach bo edim is pater. If you admit that you owe penalty payment, even if witnesses subsequently come along and testify about that very event, once you admit the knas, you are pater going forward. But clearly there is an opposing view that says moda b'knas v'achar kach bo edim is going to be chayiv. So let's continue in this journey. Itmar moda b'knas v'achar kach bo edim. So see, here we have it. So if you admit a knas and afterwards witnesses come along and testify about that very event, Rav Amar Pater. Rav says that you are Pater. Ushmuel Amar Chayiv. Shmuel says ultimately again that you're going to be Chayiv. Amar Rav Abari Eloi. My time in the Rav. Why does Rav say that you're Pater? So the Gemara says, I'll tell you why. Im himatzei be'edim, timatzei b'dayanim. So I will say the pasuk talks about im himatzei timatzei biyado hagneva. It's talking about the obligation to pay kefel. Now kefel, right, double payment for gneva, is like the paradigmatic example of a knas. Right? There's no like rhyme or reason for it. It's a penalty. So the pasuk used lashon of himatzei timatzei, a double lashon. So Rav darshans im himatzei be'edim. If the claim is proven through witnesses, then timatzei b'dayanim. Then ultimately, again, judges will have the ability to extract the money. Prat lemarshia es atzmo. This comes to exclude which case? A person who self-incriminates. Right, the person who goes ahead and obligates himself to the knas, or is moda b'knas. The Gemara says, Lamali, why do I need this whole drasha? Me'asher yarshion nafka. I could understand, we'll say from another pasuk, of asher yarshion. But so we had this earlier. To which the Gemara says, Alashmamina, moda b'knas v'achar kach bo edim pater. So also what you have to say ultimately again is that halacha l'maisa, the pasuk of Me'asher Yashin is going to be used for a different drasha, which we'll discuss in just a moment. But the concept of moda b'knas pater is learned out from the pasuk of himatzei timatzei. And the way Rav darshans it is im himatzei be'edim. Right. Ultimately, again, if the claim is proven through witnesses, timatzei, then ultimately the penalty will be imposed through judges. through judges. But if you admit the penalty yourself, then halacha l'maisa, you will not be chayiv. Incredible. Shmuel says, hahumi baile leganav atzma. No. He must say, is there to teach me about the obligation that a ganav has to kefil. Rashi says over here, mi baile leganav atzmo, it's in the third short line in Rashi, lechayiv kefil leganav atzmo, Tidarshinan klal uprat mehi matzei timatzei kidatana de bechizkia. So it says, remember, Shmuel says like this: the pasuk of matzei timatzei teaches me the concept of kefil by a ganav. Okay, the Gemara says kidatana de bechizkia. I'm sorry, kidatana de bechizkia. But say now, remember again, because the pasuk according to Shmuel, we had this before. The pasuk of himatzei timatzei was used by Tana de Bechizkia to teach me the liability of a shomer to kefil. Right? If I deposited an object with Ruvain claims it was lost or stolen, and it turns out that Ruvain himself stole it, that Ruvain's chayiv kefil. So that's learned out from the pasuk of Me'asher Yarshion, and therefore himatzei timatzei is necessary for kefil for the ganav himself. Okay, so we'll say, so bottom line, we have this machlokes Rav and Shmuel. Rav saying Moda b'knas v'achar kach bo edim is pater, and Shmuel saying Moda b'knas v'achar kach bo edim is chayiv. Okay, these are machlokes. Says Fei Rav l'Shmuel. So Rav raised the kasha to Shmuel. This is an interesting case. Ra edim shemamash mishim ubayim. Rav said, watch this case. This is fascinating. Ruvain stole an object from Shimon. Okay, Ruvain sees witnesses coming to Beis Din. The direction of Beis Din. Now, Ruvain knows that those witnesses saw him steal. So Ruvain chapsar and he says, "Va'amar ganafti avalot tavachti v'lo macharti." Right? So Ruvain says, you know what? I stole it. I stole it, but I didn't slaughter it or sell it. So what's talacha? Eino mashalin ela karen. So again, now he's telling the truth actually about the second part. He didn't sell it or slaughter it, but he stole it. So what does Ruvain do? Ruvain's a smart guy. What is he doing? He's cutting his losses. He recognizes that he's about to be outed in Beis Din by Eidim, so he figures, you know what? Let me admit at least that I stole, because if witnesses come and they testify about all of this, then what? I'm going to be chayiv kefil. But at least if I admit it myself, I'm only chayiv karen. The Gemara says it works. It works. Well, there's a beautiful Musar Haskell in this. Why does it work? Because at the end of the day, tshuva works even if it's not pure, and even if it's not good, and even if it's not motivated by the right reasons. HaKadosh Baruch Hu always appreciates a Baal Tshuva. Halacha always appreciates the Baal Tshuva, even the most insincere Baal Tshuva. So Ruvain, it's not the pshat that Ruvain has this epiphany that he wants to live life differently or be a better person. He just recognizes that literally the Eidim are making a beeline for the Beis Din. He admits his liability, and finally exempts himself from the knas. Amar Leis, the Gemara says, so what do you see from here? This would apparently would say, now, if you continue this case, the logical conclusion would be that even if witnesses were to continue on to Beis Din and testify, what would be the halacha? Ruvain would still be pater from the kefal, which shows you what? Moed b'knas, the achar kach bo edim, is pater. It's pater. Shabbos say this supports Rav is the kasha and Shmuel. So Amalei Shmuel could respond, Hacham, you know what's the case over here? Kigon shechazru edim la'achal rehem. So I would say, could very well be that the case in question is after the witnesses see that Ruvain admitted it, the witnesses never bothered testifying in Beis Din. Right? They just turn around, or for some other reason they just turn around. So this could very well be a case of where there was never any testimony after the admission. Obviously, everyone agrees if there's no testimony after the admission, then what is this? This is just a regular case of Moda B'Kinas Pater. So it says, Vahami Ditani Seifa. But look at the end. What does the end say? Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon Omer. Yavo Eidim via Idu. Yet also Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon says, let the witnesses come and testify. Michlad the Tanakama Savar. Lo. Well, so you can infer from here, that's what? That Allah the Tanakama holds that ultimately, again, even if the witnesses came and ultimately gave testimony, that ultimately the kind of wouldn't be chayiv. Amar Shmuel, Lav Ika Rabbi Elazar bar Rabbi Shimon Dekai Kavasi. So Shmuel says, look, I'll be the first to admit that this is a machlokes, but there is Rabbi Elazar bar Rabbi Shimon who holds like me. Ana da Amrik Rabbi Elazar bar Rabbi Shimon. I hold like Rabbi Elazar bar Rabbi Shimon. So again, I was supposed to say, Shmuel could admit defeat in this case, recognizing that there's different opinions. So again, this particular case absolutely contradicts my position, but my position is also corroborated through other opinions as well. Incredible. So the Shmuel Vadai Tanahir was, according to Shmuel, this idea or this machlokes of Moda B'Knas V'Acharkach Bo Eidim Chayiv or Pater is certainly a machlokes Tanoim. L'Rav Milema Tanahi, but according to Rav, is it a machlokes Tanoim? Amar l'Charav Ana Da'amri Afilu l'Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon. So Rav says the truth is I could align my pay even with Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon. How so? Ad Kano Kamar Elazar Rabbi Shimon Hasam Elamishum Deka Modi Machmas Bi Susa De'idim. We'll say up until that point, Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon only holds his position. Why? Because in the case of the Eidim are approaching, why is Reuven admitting his guilt? Out of fear of the witnesses. Out of fear of the witnesses. Avahacha. But over here, that ultimately, again, he is admitting on his own. I feel Rabbi Elazar even Rabbi Elazar would agree that a pure hodah, a pure admission, ultimately absolves the person of the knas, even if witnesses subsequently come. Amar of Hamnuna. So we'll say so again. So bottom line, what are we left with over here? We are still left with our fundamental machlokes. Again, what does everybody agree with? Moda b'knas pater. What's the machlokes case? Moda b'knas, Reuven admits that he stole from Shimon, and then achar kach bo edim, then witnesses came and testified that Reuven stole from Shimon. So ultimately, is Reuven chayiv kefal or not? Machlokes Rav and Shmuel. Okay, that machlokes still stands. I will say, now we come to a tremendous piece of a tremendous qualifier. Amar Rav Hamnuna says, Mistabra Milsei de Rav. Rav's position that Mota B'Knas V'Achar Kach Bo Eidim is Pater only applies in the following scenario. Ba'omer Ganafti Ubo Eidim Shaganov Pater Shahari Chayiv Atzmo B'Keren. Listen to this, I will say. Let me read the whole thing. Aval Amar Lo Ganafti Ubo Eidim Shaganov V'Chazer Amar V'Tavachti U'Macharti Ubo Eidim Shetavach U'Machar Chayiv Shai Pater Atzmo B'Klub. All right, so now let's take this apart. So comes Rav Hamnuna, and Rav Hamnuna gives a very important qualifier to the position of Rav. Even Rav who holds that Moda B'Knas V'Achar Kach Bo Eidim is Pater only holds that when Reuven admits, Reuven says like this: I admit that I stole. Ultimately, again, and then witnesses come and testify that Reuven stole from Shimon. Okay, so then the position of Rav is Moda B'Knas V'Achar Kach Bo Eidim is Pater. What is Reuven going to be chayiv? Keren, and that's it. It's Pater from Kefal. Watch this, I will say. What happens if Reuven said, you know what, I didn't do anything. I didn't steal. I didn't go ahead and I didn't do anything. And then what happens, I will say, witnesses come along and they testify that Reuven stole. And after they give that testimony, Reuven says, you know what, I also sold and slaughtered it. So we'll say, Rav Hamnuna says, in that case, Reuven is not Pater from the Knas. Right? I will say, this is fascinating. The concept of what Rav Hamnuna is suggesting is, Modeh B'Knas Pater only applies in a situation where through your admission, you obligate yourself to something and also exempt yourself from something else. But if your admission only serves to exempt you, but doesn't obligate you in anything, then that admission is meaningless. So isn't that fascinating? And really what it is it's implicit in the word hodah. Right? What does hodah mean? Right? Admission means what? Admission by definition carries with it some level of, I'll give you a mashal of a doma. Let's say, you ever receive an apology from someone when they say, I'm sorry if something I did hurt your feelings? Right? Ever receive, right? What's generally your reaction to an apology like that? Right? That's nothing. That's nothing. Why? You're not owning what you did. I think many of us have actually done that a number of times as well, right? Right? Because again, I might feel in my heart like I didn't do anything to you. Come on, grow up. Like it's nothing. But again, I'm sorry if something I did hurt your feelings. There's no hodah in there, right? There's no, because essentially implicit in that statement is you're probably overreacting or being too sensitive. So I'm sorry you're so sensitive and such a baby, right? I'm sorry, right, that you are such a baby, right? So again, when there's no hodah, there's no skin in the game. So this is actually fascinating. So Hamnuna says the concept of Modeh B'Knas Pater means through your hodah, you obligate yourself in something. So therefore, this is a meaningful admission. Because it's a meaningful admission, it will exempt you from the knas. So therefore, again, when Reuven admits that he stole from Shimon, and then witnesses show up and say, yeah, Reuven stole from Shimon, okay, because you obligated yourself in the Karen, you're going to be patur from Kefil. But if witnesses show up and said to witnesses show up and they say Reuven stole from Shimon, and then afterwards Reuven says, yes, and I also sold it, I slaughtered and sold it. So Reuven's very proud of himself because now Moed to the Knas, right? He just admitted what he did, and he should be patur again either 2 or 3 times, right? Additional building on the kefil. That doesn't work. Why doesn't it work? Because at the end of the day, his hodah, his admission, ultimately again doesn't obligate himself in anything. So because of that, halacha l'maisa, it's not a valid admission. Incredible. So the Gemara goes right to Amar Rava. So what says this? Rava comes along and he says, "Kapachti l'sabi de Rav." So ultimately, again, I have a way to refute the position of Rav Hamnuna. The Rabbi Gamliel polter asmami klum hava. I will say again, when Rabbi Gamliel made his statements, right? Rabbi Gamliel was trying to exempt himself from everything. Rabbi will say, when Rabbi Gamliel said that I knocked out the eye of Tavi, my servant, what does Rabbi Gamliel obligating himself in? What was he obligating himself in? But there's no actual financial liability incurred. In other words, we'll say he loses an asset, but he did not have to pay anything. It was not money out of his pocket. Yet again, the Havamina is that the admission would work to free him from the penalty. So we'll say, so what do you see from here? You see from here that Moda B'Knas, even if it doesn't hit you in the wallet, should still ultimately work. So the Gemara says, yet again, Rav Chis says Rafuna, and ultimately never answered him back. Itmar Nami, Amr Rabbi Chiya bar Abba, Amr Rabbi Yochanan, Ganafti, listen to this, Ganafti. Reuven says, I stole. Uba Edim Shaganov. Right, so ultimately, again, so Rabbi Yochanan says follows. So right, Reuven stole from Shimon, and Reuven admits that he stole. Then afterwards, Uba Edim Shaganov, and the witnesses came to go ahead and testify that Reuven stole from Shimon Pater. Ultimately, Reuven's Pater from Kefa. Why? Sheichayiv Atzma Karen. Because ultimately, again, he has absolved himself of Karen. Because again, he's obligated himself in Karen. Aval Amr Loganov. But I will say, if the witnesses came along and testified that he stole, he didn't admit it. And then after witnesses testified that he stole, Reuven said, but I slaughtered and sold it. What's the halacha? Chayiv. He cannot exempt himself. Why? Shaypater atzmo miklum. Because we will say in that case his hodah is meaningless. Because again, a hodah that ultimately again doesn't obligate you in anything is not a proper hodah. Amar Rashi says, Masnisin ubraisa nami deka. Our Mishnah and the Braisa also support this idea of Rav Hamnuna. So Mar says, Disnan ganav al pi shnayim, v'tavach umachar al pi eidachad. So again, what did we see in our Mishnah? This is quoting our Mishnah. If Reuven stole, right, based on the testimony of 2 witnesses, and he slaughtered and sold it based on an eidachad, or even based on his own admission, Meshalem tashlumei kefel, he pays kefel, ve'ena meshalem tashluma arba v'chamisha. But he doesn't pay the 4 and 5 time penalty payments. The Gemara says, Lama li detani ganav al pi shnayim. Why do you have to bring up the case, ultimately again, where he's stealing based on the testimony of 2 witnesses? Lisni ganav umachar al pi eid echad, o al pi atzmo ein meshalim ela karen. Instead, list the following case. List that if Reuven stole based on the eid echad, or based on his own admission, he only pays the karen. Right, because that'd be a case of Moed B'Knas Pater, Amud Beis, Ella, Lav, Hakamash Malon. Rather, we'll say, what is the Mishnah coming to teach us? Hakamash Malon, Ganav al Pi Shnai B'Tavach Umachar al Pi Echad, that if he stole based on the testimony of 2 witnesses, right, and he slaughtered and sold based on the testimony of 1 witness, or Pi Atzma, or through his own admission, Hu Delo Mechayev Atzma B'Keren. That's when he would not be obligating himself in Karen. And therefore, because of that, ultimately, again, I will say, same idea. Because there was no valid admission on his part and no liability through his admission, therefore he can't exempt himself from the Knas. So the Gemara says, Hu da'aminan api atzmo dumya da'api eid echad. This is the case where we would compare ultimately his own admission to the case ultimately of an eid echad. Ma'api eid echad. Just like we're also when it comes to an eid echad, Ki asi eid echad mitzaref b'hadei mechayev. But about an eid echad, remember again, if an eid echad shows up in Beis and gives testimony, that testimony obviously is meaningless. But if an eid echad shows up in Beis and then what? Another eid is mitzaref with him, that works. So the Gemara says, therefore, api atzmo nami. So too, I will say, also an admission by the thief could work the same way. How so? Ki asu eidim mechayev. We'll say even if a person admits something, if witnesses subsequently come along, he'll be chayiv. Aval ganav, we'll say now, when is that? When will he be chayiv? That be chayiv. Remember again, if his hoda'ah does not by definition incur some personal liability. So, but again, aval ganav v'tavach umachar api edachad. But ultimately, again, if Reuven stole, slaughtered, sold based on testimony of an eid echad, o al pi atzmo, or through his own admission, dechayiv atzmo bekeren, where he has obligated himself in the principle, lo amrinon al pi atzmo dumya de eid echad. In that case, Rabosai, we would not say that his own admission ultimately is like the presence of one witness, meaning that even though by the presence of one witness, if another witness showed up, it would ultimately make it into a fit testimonial unit. By his own admission, if witnesses were to show up afterwards, he would be pater. So I'll say, all the Gemara was doing with that was showing from our Mishnah, backing up the assertion of Rav Hamnuna, that the concept of modeh b'knas pater only applies where your hoda'ah creates the assumption of some level of liability. But if your hoda'ah just serves to totally exempt you from everything, then ultimately even Rav will agree that you're pater. So therefore, again, I'll say one more time just to give you the illustration of it. So if Reuven admits that he stole the sheep, and then ultimately again witnesses show up and say Reuven stole the sheep from Shimon, then ultimately again modeh b'knas pater. Why? Because through his hoda'ah he has assumed responsibility for the keren. So therefore again that's the case where then he's going to be exempt from the kefah. But if Reuven stole from Shimon, witnesses showed up and said Reuven you stole from Shimon, and Reuven says and I slaughtered and sold. So if Rabbi will say he won't be pater. Why won't he be pater? Because that admission doesn't create any liability for him. I mean, the liability it creates is that now he's a thief. But it doesn't create any financial liability, and because of that, ultimately, again, you can't apply the concept of modeh b'knas pater. So therefore, I will say we just proved that assertion from the Mishnah. Braisa, we could also prove from the Braisa. The Sanya. So this is our case of Reuven stole from Shimon, and what happened? Reuven sees witnesses that are getting ready to come to Beis Din. Reuven's fearful that they're going to out him. So what does he do? V'amar ganafti aval lo macharti. Right? Lo tavachti v'lo macharti. So Reuven comes along, Reuven walks into Beis Din and says, I did it, I stole, but good news and bad news. The bad news is I stole. The good news is I did not slaughter or sell the animal. So what's the halacha? Fine, that's modeh b'knas pater. So the Gemara says, Inu mishalim ala keren. Ultimately, again, all he has to pay is keren. That's a case of modeh b'knas pater. Says the Gemara, Lama li lemisna v'amar ganafti v'lo macharti v'lo tavakti v'lo macharti. We'll say first wide line on Amud Beis. Why does Reuven have to say I stole, but I didn't slaughter it and sell it? In other words, what's that? I understand what it means when he says I stole. That's the modeh b'knas pater. But what does it mean ultimately when he says I didn't slaughter it and sell it? What's that? So nisni o ganafti o tavakti umacharti. So again, I will say, why not just go ahead and set it up as an either or case? In other words, set it up as two different cases. Either again, where Reuven walks into Beis Din and he says, I stole, right? He's admitting that he stole, or that he walks into Beis Din admitting that he slaughtered and sold. Why not set it up like that? We'll say, why doesn't the Brisa set it up like that? Now it makes sense. Elaha kamash malon, taima da amar ganafti hu dechayev atzmo b'keren, the pater. So we'll say, it makes a lot of sense. The reason why ultimately, again, he is pater from kefal in this case is why Rabbi say, because by claiming ganafti, by admitting that he stole, what did he do? He obligated himself in keren. Because he obligated himself in keren, that's when we can say modeh b'knas pater. That's when he can exempt himself ultimately again from the kefal. Aval Omar lo ganafti. But we'll say if Reuven remains, firm in his claim that he did not steal anything, uba eidim sheganav, and witnesses then showed up and said you did steal. The chazer v'amar tavachti macharti, and Reuven trying to cut his losses. Now again I will say. Now remember, after witnesses go ahead and claim that he stole, obviously Reuven's admission that he stole would be meaningless, right? Because witnesses already proved it. So Reuven figures, what can I do? I could admit that I slaughtered or sold it, and then what happens? Amar tavachti macharti, uba edim shetavachu machar, and ultimately again, then witnesses showed up and said that he slaughtered it and sold it. The lo chayiv atzmo b'keren, where I will say Reuven's admission did not obligate himself in anything. Ultimately chayiv, he's going to have to pay the arba v'chamisha. Alma hoda de tvicha lav hodahi. What do you see from here? You see from here that an admission regarding slaughtering and selling ultimately, again, is not a proper hodah in halacha. So we'll say, so ultimately, again, the Braisa and the Mishnah both proving the same concept of Rav Hamnuna. All of this is Rav Hamnuna's nuanced detail in the position of Rav. According to Rav, who says, Modeh b'knas pater. Actually, the truth is, it's really not just in Rav, it's really according to everyone, but interestingly enough, he's framing it. Right, the way Rav Huna frames it is, Mistabra milsei de Rav, because Rav holds, Modeh b'knas is pater all the time. Right, even if Rav holds, even if witnesses subsequently show up in Beis Din, still Modeh b'knas is going to be pater. Rav Hamnuna says, just to be clear, Modeh b'knas is only pater in a situation where your hodah, your admission, makes you liable for something, right? That's what an admission is. You have skin in the game. But when your admission exempts you from everything, then ultimately, again, you are not pater. So now we'll say all we've done in the Gemara is we've proven this assertion both from our Mishnah and from the Braisa mentioned Amud Aleph. To which the Gemara says, lo, maybe not. He gufa kamash malon. Since ultimately, again, in the Braisa's case, Reuven admitted that I stole, even though initially he said I did not go ahead and slaughter and steal, and then witnesses came that he slaughtered and stole pater. Ultimately, he's going to be pater. Why? My timer. Tashlume arba v'chamisha amrachmana v'lo tashlume arba v'lo tashlume shlosha. So we'll say, so this is actually an interesting idea. So Gemara just suggests maybe the Braisa's proof is not a good proof. We'll say, it could very well be in a case like this. Watch this. It's actually very interesting that in a case ultimately again where halacha l'maisa that where Reuven says ganafti, right? And then witnesses come, right? So he admits that he stole, right? So modeh b'knas pater. So ultimately again, even if let's say he said I did not slaughter or steal, then witnesses show up and say you did slaughter and steal, that Reuven would not be chayiv. Why wouldn't Reuven be chayiv? This is actually quite fascinating. Why wouldn't he be chayiv? It's a technicality. What's the technicality? Arba v'chamisha is built on kefel. So therefore, we'll say it could very well be that in a case where there's no kefel, there's obviously not going to be arba v'chamisha as well, which is illogical. So therefore, just an interesting, nuanced idea that if Reuven comes along and Reuven says, "I admit that I stole, but I didn't slaughter and steal. I didn't slaughter and sell," and then witnesses show up and say that Reuven did slaughter and sell. Maybe what the Braisa is teaching me is Reuven will not be chayiv, because since through his admission he's pater from kefel, and kefel serves as the first two payments of arba v'chamisha. If you're pater from kefel, you can't be chayiv in arba v'chamisha. Okay, interesting idea. Hold in the back of your mind. We'll see what we do with that. So let me continue. So I'll say. So the truth is, maybe this point of Rav Hamnuna about about whether or not a hodah requires you to make yourself liable for something in order to pater you from the knas. Maybe this is a machlokes tanoim. Here we go. So the Gemara says, or I should say, I say it differently. Let me take that back. Rashi says the lema ketanoi over here is, does a hodah of tvicha, look at Rashi, it's actually the last wide line in Rashi, lema ketanoi, hodah te tvicha, I hodah havya below hodah de geneva, to lo mechayiv asam bekaren, lepotro, im bo edim olo. So we'll say, here's the shaila. Ultimately, again, if you admit that you slaughtered and sold, right, but you did not admit the theft, so this is the case we were just mentioning before, that halacha l'maisa, Reuven did not admit that he stole. Witnesses came along and ultimately, again, made him chayiv for geneva. Then Reuven admitted that he slaughtered and sold. So Rav Hamnuna was saying about, Rav Hamnuna says that admission doesn't work. Why doesn't that admission work? Why doesn't it work? Because halacha l'maisa, you haven't made yourself liable in anything. So because you haven't made yourself liable in anything, therefore you can't say modeh b'knas pater. So the Gemara suggests maybe this whole thing is a machlokes tanaim. Here we go. Hayu shnayim mi'idin shaganav. So listen, I watch this. If there are two people testifying that ultimately Reuven stole, vayu shnayim mi'idin also shetavach, and two witnesses testifying that Reuven went ahead and slaughtered it and sold it, Chuzmu Eidei Geneva. So we'll say if the witnesses that were giving testimony about the Geneva were made into Zolomim, so ultimately Eidu Shabbat Lamitzah Sabat Lakula. So we'll say in that case again the whole testimony falls apart, right? Because remember again, without testimony about the Geneva, there's no Tuvicha or Mechira. So we're talking about over here two sets. We saw this in yesterday's daf. Two sets of witnesses, right? Set one testify about the fact that Reuven stole from Shimon. Set two testify about the fact that Reuven slaughtered and sold. If set one who testified about the Geneva ultimately again are made into Eidim Zomim, then halacha l'maisa, the whole testimony falls apart. Okay, who's mu'edei tedicha? What happens if the witnesses who testified about the theft are totally good, kosher? Who becomes, excuse me, sorry. So ultimately again, who's mu'edei tedicha? We'll say, what happens if the witnesses who give testimony about the slaughter and selling, they are the ones ultimately again who become Eidim Zomim? So what's the halacha? So what says now? Obviously, Ruvain has to pay kefil. Right? Ruvain has to pay kefil. Right? Why does Ruvain have to pay kefil? Because the life of his witnesses that corroborate the fact that he stole. Okay? Dehain mishalmin tashlume shlosha. Well, say, interestingly enough, the witnesses, the second witness is about the Tvicha Mechira, they're going to pay the 2 and 3 times. In other words, whatever is above the kefil to get you to the Arba V'chamisha. Fine. So in other words, Mishum Sumcha Samra. Supposed to say, so that actually we saw this yesterday. Mishum Sumcha Samra, but Sumcha said, Hey Mishalmin Tashlume Kefil, V'hu Mishalim Tashlume Shlosha Lapar, Ushnayim La'ayil. So Sumcha says the witnesses will pay kefil, and ultimately again, Ruvain will pay Tashlume Shlosha, right? Shlosha or Shnayim, whatever you need to get to Arba V'chamish, the remaining amount. So the Gemara says, Sumchos, what are you referring to? Ahiyah, which case are you referring to? Ahiyah Kai. Ahiyah Kai Sumchos. To what case is Sumchos referring to? We'll say, now remember again, 2 cases in the Braisa. Case number 1, we'll say the common denominator between 2 cases is both cases have 2 sets of witnesses testifying against Ruvain. Set 1 testifies that Ruvain stole. Set 2 testifies that Ruvain slaughtered and sold. In case number one, so ultimately again, it's the witnesses who testify about the theft that become Eidim Zomim. What happens in that case when the first set of witnesses become Eidim Zomim? What happens? Whole thing falls apart. In case 2, and therefore again, I will say when that happens, there's no liability for anything. I take that back. The first set of witnesses ultimately will pay kefil because that's what they sought to impose. In case number 2, the second set of witnesses, the witnesses on the Tadicho Mechira, they are the ones who become Eidim Zomim. So therefore, again, those witnesses are going to have to pay the 3 times amount, and Ruvain is going to have to pay the kefil. Sumchas comes along and says, really the witnesses should pay kefil, and Ruvain should have to pay the extra 2 or 3 times. The Gemara says, Sumchas, what case are you referring to? Ilema Aresha. If you want to say it's the first case, that can't be, because what's in the first case is where the witnesses on the theft are the ones who became Eidim Zomim. Remember, again, I will say that's the case. So Leslie the Sumchas, Eidim Shabbat Mitzvah Lahula. We'll say even Sumchas will agree that if the witnesses who testify about the theft become Eidim Zomim, then what Rabbi say? It goes without saying that the entire testimony falls apart. The Ela As-Seifa. Rather, it must be the second case. I was saying, remember, in the second case is where the second set of witnesses who testify about the Tvich and Mechira, they are the ones who become the Eidim Zomim. So the Gemara says, if it's the Seifa, Shapir Ka'amri Rabbanon. Then I will say, ultimately, again, the Rabbanon's position makes sense. Humishayim Tashlumi Kefel. Ruvain will pay kefil, because remember again, there's proper testimony that he stole. And ultimately the witnesses who testified about Tvich and Bechira, they sought to make Ruvain chayiv another 2 or 3 times. That's the amount they should have to pay. So what's going on over here? So Sumchas, how can you reverse that? Rather, I will say, it must be that there must be another case or another situation kind of embedded in all of this. Kigon, the Asu Beitrei, I will say, it must be that what? It must be that 2 witnesses showed up and they said, Amrlei, Ganafta. Right? I will say, there must be another case that's not written out explicitly that Sumchas is commenting on. What's this other case? Here we go. I will say, it's almost like a Chisuri Mechsera type of answer the Gemara is giving. What's the other case? Listen to this, fascinating. I will say, the case is, Asu Beitrei, Amrlei, Ganafta. Ultimately, again, 2 witnesses showed up. They say, Ruvain, you stole. So we'll say, so they're showing up in Basin and they're testifying that Ruvain stole. Amalu in ganafti utevachti umacharti. Oh, okay. So as well said, Ruvain admits it. Now remember again, his admission for the theft, is that going to help him or not? Is it going to help him? No, why not? Why not? Witnesses already testified, right? Remember again, Moda B'Kinas Pater only works when you are the first one who makes the Beis Din aware of your infraction. So in this case over here, right, Ruvain's brought to Beis Din. Witnesses say, we saw you stole. Ruvain says, yes, I stole, and I also slaughtered and sold. Right? Mihu, so we'll listen to this. Mihu lo bifnechem ganafti. So okay, now this is going to throw a wrinkle into this. This is actually a fascinating case. So watch this. I'll say, watch what's happening over here. Really, really exciting. So I'll say, so watch this. Get ready. We're going to start now. I don't say, so now, Reuven is in Beis Din. Witnesses show up. And witnesses say, Reuven, you stole. Okay, that's part one. Part two, Reuven says, yes, I did it, and I also slaughtered and sold. That's part two. Part three, right? Bombshell. Reuven says, but you didn't see me steal. You guys are lying. I'm admitting that I stole, but you guys did not see it. You're not the witnesses who stole it, right? So, miu lo bifnechem kanafti. I did not steal in your presence. What's happening over here? So, witnesses are the ones that started this process. Witnesses are the ones that got Reuven to admit. So, Reuven admitted the theft. He admitted that he slaughtered and sold. And now Reuven is saying to the witnesses, but you guys didn't see me do it. You're lying. I'm admitting that I did it, but you're lying that you saw me do it. Miu lo bifnechem ganafti. Watch this. Va'isi sahadi va'azme inhu delo ba'payo ganov. Wow, watch this. So now another set of witnesses. Set two come along. And they say, set one, you cannot have seen Reuven steal the item. Why not? You were with us. I was saying, this is exciting. This is like reality TV over here, right? This is better. You should pay for this, right? So I'll say, so now what happens? So set number two come along and indeed make set number one Eidim Zomamin. Right? So the Gemara says, now, okay, watch this, it gets better. Va'isi balabayis sahadi. Then the balabai Shimon, who owns the stolen object, he brought witnesses. Va'asidu bei teganav v'tavach umachar. And I will say, so now, I will say there's a third set of witnesses. Third set of witnesses brought by Shimon the Balabas, that indeed Reuven stole, slaughtered, and sold. I will say, so okay, now let's put the case, one more time, let's put the case together. Set one of witnesses, bring Reuven to Beis Din. They say, Reuven, you stole the object. Reuven says, yes, I stole, and I also slaughtered and sold. And then Reuven says, shocking revelation, Reuven says, witnesses, you guys are lying, you didn't see me. Second set of witnesses come along, and indeed prove, make the first set of witnesses Eidim Zomin, they did not see Reuven steal the item. Balabayas, Shimon, owner of the object, then brings a third set of witnesses. The third set of witnesses testify that what? That Reuven stole, slaughtered, and sold. Here's our case. So let's see now, what's our shaila? The Gemara says, "Ubahadas tevicha umechira kamiflagi." So I'll say, so now at play over here is what is the status of Reuven's admission about the slaughter and theft. Now I'll say, here's what's interesting. It appears, based on the conversation over here, that halacha l'maisa, everyone is going to take it for granted that Reuven did not exempt zero. It's like, you can make the argument that what? Since it turns out that the initial set of witnesses were Eidim Zomamin, maybe Reuven's admission is a case of Moda B'Knas, Moshe David Hatzlacha. Right? Maybe ultimately, again, you could see that maybe his initial admission was indeed a Moda B'Knas Potter case. Maybe that's what it is. So I will say, so that's the Havamin over here. The Gemara doesn't seem to entertain that possibility. Why? It's not a Hodah. Why is it not a Hodah? Because halacha l'maisa, Reuven didn't admit of his own volition. Why did he admit? Because witnesses made him chayiv in court. Even though it turns out that the witnesses were lying, but l'maisa, the admission was not of Reuven's own volition. So the shaila over Rabbi says, what about his admission regarding the tvicha and mechira? The Rabbanan Savri, afa gav doda digneva machmas edim hu de kamoda hoda de tvicha hoda hiopater. The Rabbanan will say that even though the admission regarding the theft ultimately, again, was motivated through Eidim, nevertheless, the Rabbanan hold that the admission regarding the Tvicha and Mechira is a proper Hodah, and therefore, again, he's going to be pater on the additional 2 or 3 times payment. Sumcha says, absolutely not. Kevan Hodah Digneva Machmas Eidim Hu. And Rabbi said the Rabbanan's logic is because at the end of the day, as much as it was motivated by Eidim, it wasn't motivated by bona fide Eidim. Turns out to be Eidim Zomamin. And therefore, again, his admission ultimately, again, by Tvich and Mechira will be valid. Sumchas holds Kevan Dehodah Digneva Machmas Eidim Hu de Kamoda de Tvicha Lav Hodah. Sumchas will say that since at the end of the day his Hodah regarding Geneva was not a proper Hodah, therefore halacha l'maisa, ultimately, again, his Hodah regarding Tvicha is also not a proper odah. B'hanach idin kamma idazim b'shamet Hashem kev. I'm going to stop over here for today. I'm going to stop kind of like in the middle of this case. We'll pick up with this case in Be'ezus Hashem tomorrow. I just want to point out kind of what our outstanding issues are. Outstanding issue number one is our machlokis Rav and Shmuel. Moed the kinas v'achakach bo edim, are you pater or chayiv? That's number one. Number two is a statement of Rav Hamnuna. That halacha l'maisa, again, when witnesses come along and say ganafti, right, when witnesses come along and say that halacha l'maisa, when you're moed the kinas and you say ganafti, but then ultimately, when witnesses come along and make you chayiv for theft, but then you admit tzvicha and mechira, are you pater for that? Or do we say, Rav Hamnuna's statement, that halacha l'maisa, an admission that doesn't make you liable anything, ultimately, again, is not a true admission. Whether or not Rav Hamnuna's statement is true halacha l'maisa, and may Hashem to be seen tomorrow, bosai, shkoyach.